Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Abdulaziz Al-Sha'rawi, and I'm a Kevin Harrington Student Ambassador. I'm so pleased to be with you tonight and to have the chance to introduce our guest speaker, Mr. Craig Whitney. He's a former foreign correspondent and editor at the New York Times and has written Living with Guns, where he explores the Second Amendment, calling it one of the most divisive issues in America today. He has a great understanding of this issue and a great appreciation of what it takes to truly make American life safely with guns and to continue on a path of progress and a remarkable vision of the future of USA. Besides that, Mr. Whitney received an AB degree in French history and literature from Harvard College in 1965. In the same year, he started working at the Times as an assistant to James Reston in the Washington Bureau. Then he enlisted in the U.S. Naval Reserve in 1966 and obtained a commission at Officer Candidate School in Newport, Rhode Island. Mr. Whitney returned to the Times in 1969 as a reporter in New York City. Then he went back to Saigon as a war correspondent, serving as bureau chief. Later he reported from Bonn, Moscow, London, Berlin, and Paris during the Cold War and collapse of communism in East Germany, Eastern Europe, and the Soviet Union. He has had more than 3,200 articles, bylined articles in the Times. Later, he served as a foreign editor and Washington editor before returning to foreign correspondence in the late 1980s. Finally, he's also just a fascinating person, and we are all in for a treat today. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Mr. Craig Whitney.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you all for being here on a day when there is such big news. When I first started thinking 8 years ago about writing a book about the Second Amendment, I thought that as a self-confessed liberal that my research would probably prove that what the National Rifle Association and other radical gun rights groups keep telling Americans about it is all wrong. When the Supreme Court ruled that the District of Columbia couldn't ban handguns because the Second Amendment protected an individual right to firearms for self-defense, in 2008 that was, and the opinion was a 5-4 conservative majority written by Justice Scalia. I thought when I heard that, well, there they go again, those conservative justices falling for the NRA's line, hook, line, and sinker. But then I started doing research into the history of the Second Amendment and how it was written, how it came about in the magnificent main building of the New York Public Library. And eventually I came to a conclusion that surprised me, which is that the Second Amendment does protect the right of individual Americans to have and use firearms for self-defense, among other things, a right that existed in common law in England and here ever since John Smith first arrived in Jamestown. What it has never done, the Second Amendment, is to forbid regulation of those firearms to protect the right of the public, gun owners and non-owners alike, to live in safety. I believe the NRA and other gun rights extremists are completely wrong on that point. And I think they know it, but they keep saying it anyway when they claim that the right the Second Amendment recognizes is an absolute right. It is a right that existed in the colonies before independence, but it was always connected with civic duty, and it always coexisted from the earliest days with what amounts to gun registration and gun control at a local level. For the past decade, gun violence has been taking about 30,000 American lives a year. That's more than Al-Qaeda has taken in all its history. And more than half of those gun deaths are suicides. Most of the rest are homicides or accidents. And almost all of them involve handguns, not, quote, assault rifles, a misnomer. The semi-automatic semi-automatic weapons that have turned up in mass shootings disproportionately are not technically assault rifles, which are fully automatic rifles that look like some of them that are used by the U.S. military. And we've had a lot of these mass shootings, from Columbine quite a while ago to Tucson 2 years ago, where Gabrielle Giffords, then a member of Congress, was shot in a shopping mall along with 18 other people, 6 of whom died. Then there was Aurora, Colorado, last summer, when 12 people were killed and 58 wounded in the movie theater. And yet we have refused until recently to even start a discussion about what we could realistically agree on to make all these horrors at least less frequent, if not prevent them altogether. My book came out on November 13, was published then, and I wrote at the end of the introduction to it that unless we did start trying to find common ground about how to deal with the gun violence problem, the next mass shooting was going to be just a matter of time. And it was a month. On December 14 came something truly unimaginable, at least to me, and I'm sure to most of us, the mass murder by a deeply disturbed young man of 20 innocent small children and 6 teachers and administrators at the Sandy Hook Elementary School in Newtown, Connecticut. Well, I thought that horrific event made clear that the decades-long stalemate we've had about guns in this country had to end. Now, more than ever, I think gun owners should recognize that they have a responsibility to contribute to constructive discussions about how to find solutions to the real problem of gun violence in our country, not to distort all attempts to control the violence or the increasingly deadly weapons that the Founding Fathers could never have imagined as hidden stealth ways of seizing everybody's guns. The NRA is doing that right now. I don't think it's a service to gun owners to say that all regulations are unconstitutional or are just disguised ways of finding an excuse to seize everybody's guns, or at least the guns that gun control enthusiasts like least. But the NRA has been saying that for years, and it's hammering away at the same argument since Newtown. And it's waging what it calls the fight of the century against any attempt to strengthen gun control. I think it's time for gun owners who don't agree with the NRA's political views to speak their minds, and there are a lot of them. Gabrielle Giffords and her husband, Mark Kelly, have started a new public interest group called Americans for Responsible Solutions, and it has the aim of launching a national conversation about gun violence prevention. When they announced the formation of this group, they said in a statement, quote, "We don't want to take away your guns any more than we want to give up the guns we have locked in a safe at home." Well, there are others like them who have begun speaking out. One of them is the former governor of Alaska. Sarah Palin? No, one of her predecessors, Tony Knowles, a Democrat who was governor for 6 years until 2002. He wrote to the New York Times last month saying, "I proudly join all of the veterans, gun owners, and hunters who understand and value the rights and responsibilities that come with gun ownership and have the backbone to state their case," unquote. And the same day in the Times, the author Justin Cronin, who describes himself as a liberal gun owner, wrote, quote, "It's far too easy to buy a gun. I once bought one in a parking lot, and I loathe the National Rifle Association, but calling gun owners a bunch of inbred rednecks doesn't do much to advance rational discussion." And he's certainly right about that. Now, more than ever, Americans who advocate stronger gun control and want to try to convince gun owners that it makes sense can do that only if they make it clear that they accept that the right to keep and bear arms is an individual right of all Americans. Effective regulation in a country with 300 million guns in private hands is not a simple problem. And there are no simple solutions. Eliminating the so-called assault rifles like the AR-15 type Bushmaster 223 semi-automatic rifle that Adam Lanza used in Newtown would not do anything, for example, to reduce the street gun violence that plagues us, because most of that is committed with illegal and unregistered handguns. That 223 semi-automatic rifle belonged to his mother, along with other weapons that he took with him to the school. We don't know enough yet about exactly what happened when he went to her house and killed her. Did she give him the weapons? Did he kill her and then take the weapons? It's just not clear. But in any case, the weapons were legally owned by her. The most recent year for which statistics are available about how many people are victims of gun violence or fatalities is 2011, and there were 11,000 people killed that way in that year. There were also that year 19,800 suicides with firearms, and again, mostly handguns. Making the AR-15s illegal would not prevent people who don't respect the law from using rifles or far more often handguns illegally to commit crimes. And worrying only about hardware, guns, without also addressing the social and psychopathological problems that have so often driven mass shooters will not bring mass shootings to an end. I think it's really past time that our political leaders reached across the ideological divide to try to find measures they can agree on to prevent so many mass shootings. Well, I'm not encouraged by what's happened in the last week. President Obama, of course, had made, a month after Newtown, proposals for comprehensive legislation and also some executive actions that don't require congressional approval to deal with guns and gun violence. Among the measures that he announced then or proposed were improvements to mental health care, toughening prosecution of criminals who use guns to commit crimes, cracking down on people who buy guns knowingly for people in the categories existing federal law makes ineligible to buy guns from dealers. That is known as straw purchasing, buying guns for somebody who can't buy them legally. Defining the categories of people in existing federal law who can't buy a gun from a dealer more precisely is another one of the proposals he made. And making the states report the names of such people in a more timely fashion and more completely to the federal database that the FBI uses to clear gun sales by dealers. That's the background check. Importantly, he proposed closing the loophole that now exempts as much as 40% of all gun sales from the background check requirement, that is, private sales, whether at gun shows or anywhere else. Well, yesterday, the Senate Judiciary Committee voted on strict party lines to approve that measure, that is, making the background check universal to apply to private sales as well as sales by dealers. No Republicans on the panel voted for it. Yet I believe that measure is the single most important one that in the package, and that could do more than anything else I can think of to at least give us a chance of reducing the rate of gun violence that we have. I think if the Senate votes along party lines, it'll approve that. What will happen in the House, I don't know. But I would say that if Congress does not pass legislation to close the background check loophole, it should be ashamed of itself. I think Wayne LaPierre of the NRA, who's bitterly opposed to this and has reiterated that since yesterday, should be especially ashamed of himself because back in 1999, he testified before another subcommittee for closing the loophole. Here's what he said in 1999, quote, we think it's reasonable to provide mandatory instant criminal background checks for every sale at every gun show. No loopholes anywhere for anyone. That's not the way he's talking today. Instead, he talks about resisting criminalizing gun owners by expanding the background check to include everybody. It's not going to criminalize anybody, but it might keep criminals from getting a hold of guns that they shouldn't have. Now, the Obama proposals and others Dianne Feinstein has made include reinstating the so-called assault weapons ban. Congress and the Bush administration allowed the last one to lapse in 2004, 10 years after it was passed. And the legislation that is being discussed would make it impossible to sell or import rifles with pistol grips, collapsible stocks, or any other single characteristic defining an assault weapon. The earlier ban had lots of loopholes, and it allowed two of those. More than two were not allowed. The measure that Feinstein has proposed would affect 157 different specific guns, and it would ban magazines that hold more than 10 rounds for all semi-automatics and also handguns. But it's not going to seize anybody. It wouldn't seize anybody's weapons if it were passed. It would grandfather the 3 to 4 million such rifles that are already out there, but require that anybody who bought one or inherited it would have to pass the federal background check first. It would also make it mandatory for people who own such weapons to store them safely so that children and others can't easily get access to them, something that might have been missing in Newtown. As I say, we don't yet know enough about exactly how Adam Lanza got hold of those guns. I think the model that they have in mind, Feinstein and probably the president, is the 1934 National Firearms Act. This came about partly as a consequence of the St. Valentine's Day massacre in Chicago in 1929. This was a mob massacre. Al Capone's boys had lots of money and could afford fully automatic machine guns and Tommy guns, and because they'd made so much money selling alcohol to thirsty Americans during Prohibition. And they lined their rivals up against a wall and sprayed them with machine gun bullets. And the public had a backlash against this kind of violence. There were other incidents like it, got out of hand. Well, the National Firearms Act of 1934 came in, of course, signed by President Roosevelt, was aimed at taking Tommy guns and sawed-off shotguns off the streets, out of the hands of the mob, by making them very difficult and expensive for people to buy and own. Anybody who wants to do that nowadays, own a fully automatic weapon, has to submit fingerprints and photographs and be registered with the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. A gun enthusiast told me at a meeting like this in Hartford a couple of weeks ago that there may be as many as 500,000 of them out there. Well, you don't hear the NRA complaining very loudly about why we can't just go out and buy fully automatic machine guns if we want them. But no machine guns were used in Newtown, nor in Aurora, nor in Tucson, nor at Virginia Tech, nowhere. None of these mass shootings have involved fully automatic weapons. So, maybe we'll see things will change. But these measures have also, there's been a lot of resistance to them. And I'm not convinced that even the limit on what magazines can hold will get through Congress. Senator Lindsey Graham of South Carolina, for instance, said at a hearing in January, "Would I be a reasonable American to want my family to have the 15-round magazine in a semi-automatic weapon, if there were a limit of only 15 rounds? to make sure if there's 2 intruders, she doesn't run out of bullets. I guess he was imagining a mother with her children at home and somebody's trying to break in, and she's going to use her semi-automatic pistol or rifle to fend them off, and 15 rounds isn't enough, he says, maybe. Well, when I was serving as a Navy lieutenant in Saigon during the Vietnam War, in a war zone, during a war, I was issued a .45 pistol for self-defense. It had magazines that held 7 rounds. So 7 rounds is enough in a war zone, it seems, at least the Navy thought so. And if it isn't enough in South Carolina in peacetime today, I hate to think what kind of a violent place South Carolina might be. In New York State, Governor Cuomo was able to get the state legislature in Albany to pass a 7-round limit on magazines and a ban on new sales of assault rifles and a requirement for previously bought ones to be registered within a year. He did that in less than a month of furious lobbying after Newtown. Even in Colorado, they've been discussing a proposal for a 15-round limit on magazines, what magazines can hold. I think, though, that the most significant part of the New York law as far as preventing mass shootings goes is the provision that enables mental health care professionals to report the names of patients they consider potentially dangerous so that law enforcement authorities can take steps to seize any weapons they may have. The President's proposals also include money to help improve mental health cares and programs to address bullying and drug use in schools. And that measure that was passed along party lines yesterday by the, or at least approved by the Senate Judiciary Committee, also includes programs for improving school security. But I don't think that a renewed assault rifle ban is going to get through Congress. Even if the Senate agreed on it, I don't think it would pass the House. Back in 1994, the first ban passed only after Ronald Reagan, Gerald Ford, Jimmy Carter, and Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, joined to urge Congress to approve it. I don't see the House passing a stronger ban today, even if George W. Bush and his father both endorsed it. Maybe it would if Rush Limbaugh endorsed it, but I don't see that happening. As for the states, well, different states will do different things. What seems reasonable to people in New York or New York City may seem quite unreasonable to people in New Hampshire or Colorado or Arizona or Montana or Texas. And to me, that's acceptable. I don't think all gun laws have to be uniform countrywide. People who live in cities like New York view gun ownership and guns generally very differently from the way people who live in the country do, even people who live in upstate New York. People who live in the South and West or in New Hampshire do not have the same view of firearms as people in cities in the East do or in California. For the past decade, I think we've been paralyzed in attempts to discuss and find reasonable things we can agree on to deal with these problems because of profound misunderstandings, many of which have been fostered deliberately by the NRA and other gun rights extremists of what the Second Amendment is and why it was written. As I said earlier, the right was a common law right brought over here by the earliest colonists who knew they would need guns for hunting and for self-defense. And I had forgotten myself, having studied early colonial history last when I was in elementary school probably, just how violent things were after the Native Americans realized that these visitors were not here just temporarily or to try to enlighten them, but intended to squat on their lands and seize them and drive them out. And of course, that's what happened. In the colonies, white males who were between the age of about 17 or 15 and 45 had the right, but also the duty to have firearms and to come with those firearms to serve in the militia in the common defense against Indian attacks or whatever when called. And that was very important. And there were registries kept in many of the colonial settlements of these rifles and muskets, I mean, and other guns. Why not? They needed to know, what kind of weapons were available if they called on people to serve in the militia and whether they were suitable. If you didn't have a weapon, sometimes they would issue you one and then make you work off the cost of it. But by and large, though the militia's performance in the Revolutionary War was later faulted by George Washington, enough Americans knew how to use the firearms they had and shoot straight with them, that with the help of the French and other factors, they won the Revolutionary War against the most powerful military force in the world at the time, the British Army, which was reinforced with Hessian mercenaries. I share the view that whether it's live free or die or not, we would not have a United States of America if it hadn't been for Americans' familiarity and facility with firearms. And as I said, I do believe the Supreme Court decision in the District of Columbia versus Heller case in 2008 found correctly that the right protected by the Second Amendment was an individual right. It concluded that the District of Columbia's ban on handguns in the home violated the right because handguns were the weapons people most commonly used for self-defense. And the ruling by Justice Scalia went on to say that self-defense was the most important purpose protected by the right. The wording in his opinion is this: the amendment, quote, surely elevates above all other interests the right of law-abiding, responsible citizens to use arms in defense of hearth and home, unquote. I think he was profoundly wrong about that. When you go back and read the debates about the Second Amendment and defenses of the right of people to keep and bear arms, you don't find much concern about individual self-defense, not certainly after the Revolutionary War. The amendment was proposed at the end of the 18th century to serve a political purpose. It was to reassure people who were afraid that the new federal government that had been established by the Constitution that was devised in 1787 to replace the unsatisfactory Articles of Confederation, create a stronger central federal government. There were many people who feared it could be too powerful. It would trample the rights of the states. In particular, there was fear that a standing federal army could be, just like the British redcoats, a force that could run amok under a power-mad general or president and do what the British redcoats had failed to do, suppress American liberty. So the amendment was clearly intended as assurance that the states could maintain their militias, which would be a deterrent both to any attempt to set up a federal army, standing federal army, and to any despotic ambitions by federal authorities to impose tyranny on a free people. And the language of the Second Amendment is often criticized for being antiquated or confusing. I don't think it is confusing. You've heard what I just said. Now, I'll remind you, the Second Amendment says, a well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Had the founders meant to create a right that didn't exist already to keep and bear arms, they would have said, the people shall have the right to keep and bear arms. But they already had it. It says the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. the people already had that right in common law, and it was not the right only of people who were in the militia. And that it should not be infringed has never meant that it could not be subject to regulation. In the 19th century, regulation was commonplace even in the so-called Wild West. Places like Dodge City required visitors to leave their guns at the edge of town. There was a sign in the main street, a large one that was hand-lettered, that said, "The carrying of firearms strictly prohibited." Well, that's Dodge City. The famous shootout at the OK Corral in Tombstone in 1881 started after Ike Clanton was fined $27.50 for violating a local ordinance that forbade openly carrying firearms within the city limits. Concealed carry was banned in Louisiana, Kentucky, Indiana, Tennessee, Virginia, and Alabama before 1839, and it was banned in most other states by the end of the 19th century. Back then, concealed carry was seen as cowardly. Real men carried their guns openly, and I guess still do here in New Hampshire. Well, we now have concealed carry laws going the other way in many states, laws adopted in recent decades because of the fear of violent crime. Violent crime was a scourge between the 1960s and the late 1980s, undeniably. It kind of coincided with the rise and fall of the crack cocaine epidemic. But today, and for the last 2 decades, it's been going down. It's dramatically down in most places. But the NRA is still scaring people to death with the idea that things are so bad out there that if you don't have a firearm with you to protect yourself, the police aren't around all the time, and some criminal can come and get you with a gun or rob you or otherwise do harm to you. If you point out that violent crime is way down, the NRA says, well, that's because of all the concealed carry laws. Criminals don't know who might be packing heat, so they're more careful about whom they attack. Well, no scientifically accurate study has been done that shows any cause of effect, although there is a book out there called More Guns, Less Crime. You read it, and I think you'd agree with me, it doesn't prove the case at all. I'm not saying it might not be proven if a careful study were done, but it hasn't been proven. And I think it would be a good idea to do a study like that. President Obama's proposals also included an executive order that instructs the Centers for Disease Control to conduct research into the causes and prevention of gun violence. But the NRA denounced studies like that in the early 1990s as a concealed form or something that could lead to gun control. And it got Congress to prohibit the CDC from doing such studies. Well, imagine if the automobile industry had forbidden the kind of research into the causes of death in automobile accidents that have led to laws requiring the use of seat belts, airbags, and changes in the structure of automobile bodies. These measures are certainly among the reasons why highway deaths fell to a record low in 2011, not the only reasons for sure. But there were 32,367 people who died in automobile accidents, motor vehicle accidents, in 2011. That compares to about 45,000 a year in the decade previous. But gun deaths from accidents, suicides, or assaults have been increasing gradually but steadily over this same period. Now, people like Mayor Bloomberg in New York City, where I live, say that it's strict gun control laws that keep people like me from buying or owning guns. That's the reason, he says, for the city's dramatic decline in murders and other gun violence in recent years. And I don't buy that either. I keep pointing out that the people who perpetrate gun violence and shoot each other or others on the streets in New York City, even at a lower rate now than they did 10 or 15 years ago, they're not law-abiding people, and the guns involved in street shootings are almost always not legally owned. So if I wanted to have a gun, I wouldn't be able to get a permit to at least not take it outside of my apartment, and the police are very parsimonious in even granting permits to have a weapon in your apartment that you can't take out at all. I think the aim of all sensible gun control laws should be not to keep guns out of the hands of as many law-abiding people as possible, but to keep guns out of the hands of people who we can all agree shouldn't have them. And President Obama has said that the aim should be to keep guns out of the hands of dangerous people. Closing the private sale loophole would certainly be a big step if Congress approved. Enforcing gun laws that are already on the books and finding ways to make them more effective is also important, as the NRA rightly keeps saying. Vigorous prosecution of people who lie in filling out forms to pass the background check when they try to buy a gun from a dealer, for instance, or people who use guns illegally in crimes should be vigorously prosecuted. The new New York State gun law does toughen the penalty for that. A few days ago, the Senate Judiciary Committee also did approve, voted in favor of a law that would make straw purchasing a felony, and in favor of a gun trafficking law. Believe it or not, there isn't a federal gun trafficking law on the books now that would make that a felony, that is, passing a gun knowingly to somebody who can't buy it or shouldn't be able to own one, with a maximum penalty of up to 15 years. Yet even that measure, which is aimed clearly at criminal behavior and only criminal behavior, only one Republican member of that committee, Senator Grassley, voted in favor of it. So, you know, will Newtown change things for Americans today the way St. Valentine's Massacre did back in the early 30s? We still can't tell. But I think the important thing is to start the conversation, keep the conversation going about things we can agree on, or try to find things we can agree on, rather than harp on what we disagree about, often irrationally, not with any logical or convincing explanation of why we take the position we do, as the NRA is apparently frightening a lot of Republican legislators in Washington and elsewhere to doing. There are other things besides gun control that we could do, and that people are doing in some places like Chicago and Boston, to work with young people who live in the troubled neighborhoods where gun violence is often a daily scourge still, to try to change the way they think about themselves and about guns, to change the destructive human behavior patterns that are a more important factor than just the guns themselves. Some of these programs use people who've served time in prison for crimes they committed when they were members of gangs. These guys come out of prison determined to start over and are enlisted to talk with the young members of the same gangs to try to persuade them that violence isn't the answer to the problems they have. I wrote Living with Guns to try to encourage everybody to think again about how to find common ground that would let us tackle our gun violence problem instead of helplessly looking on while the problem keeps getting worse and worse. And you can buy the book here after we have a Q&A period if you want, and I would be honored if you did. The Second Amendment isn't what makes it impossible for us to agree on common sense measures. It's rigid ideology and a lack of common sense that do that. Winston Churchill used to say that the world could always count on Americans to do the right thing after we had exhausted all the other possibilities. And looking at our problems today with guns and a lot of other things, I can only hope he's right. Thank you very much, and now I'll be happy to take any questions you want to put to me. Thank you.
Hi, good evening. If I understood your comments correctly, you are in favor of limiting magazine capacities to that 7 rounds you spoke of?
I'm in favor of discussing it and examining it closely. I don't myself see the need for magazines that hold 30 and even 100 rounds anywhere outside of a shooting range for self-defense. Come on. Yeah.
Okay. Would you be in favor of limiting law enforcement to 7-round magazines?
No, and in fact, the New York state law did that, and now they're going to have to draft an amendment to it to permit law enforcement authorities there to have more than 7 rounds in their weapons. Law enforcement also have often fully automatic weapons, and unlike most of the general population.
Why is a police officer's life worth more than mine?
It's not. Police officers are sworn to do what they can to protect your life, and they're often the ones who turn up in places like Aurora and have to deal with a mass shooter like that one. And you know, what law enforcement needs is often very different from what you and I need. It has nothing to do with the value of your life compared to that of a law enforcement officer. His primary mission is not to save his own life, but to save yours in a dangerous situation.
But I think the statistics show that they show up after the fact, anywhere from 5 or 2 to 5 or 10 or minutes later, that they're not there to protect that life when in fact they're there to investigate what happened.
You say that, but you know, life takes surprising turns, and the police can't be everywhere. It's true.
Okay, if I may, I had another note I wanted to ask you about. Do you think expanding the background check system could lead to a national registration system?
I'm not in favor of a national registration system. I think registration systems where they exist should be run locally or by the states, not by the federal government.
But even at the state level, do you think that that would, okay, in that case, it wouldn't be a national registration system, but rather
I don't understand why people object so strongly to a registration system. The NRA keeps saying it's just the first step to seizing your guns, but it's not.
If I may, I think I'm going to have that inclination, which is that history has clearly demonstrated that registration has led to confiscation. You could look at what happened in Nazi Germany with the Jewish people, Russia in their early history, and subsequently Cambodia, other places where registration preceded confiscation.
The United States is not Nazi Germany. It's not the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. I can tell you that. I lived there for 4 years as a correspondent. It's not Cambodia. You know, get serious. The United States is the United States, and we have a political process that protects us from that kind of excess. It's not being armed that keeps us from turning into a dictatorship. It's our political process and our Constitution.
But is it us, the citizenry, being armed, kind of the balance, one of those checks and balances embedded in the Constitution against the tyranny you spoke about earlier?
Yes, in the context of states and their militias originally. Today, you're not going to keep off, you know, prevent a violent military takeover by some lunatic in Washington with your personal store of weapons. People who think that are delusional.
I agree with you, and that's one of the reasons why I would make the argument that citizen armament should be equal to that of the police. If they can have a 15 or 30-round magazine, the population at large should have that same protective right for themselves.
You see yourself, sir, I suggest, as an adversary of the police, and
I respect what they do. They put themselves in harm's way, but I am making the point that if a police officer off duty can carry a 15 or 30 round magazine, that a civilian in his or her life at home or elsewhere with a carry permit, if they choose to carry concealed, should have that same right. And that's the argument I would like to leave you with.
You're entitled to the view. Thank you.
Thanks for coming. I listened to you when you talked about why they wrote the Second Amendment at all, because there was a big, I think you said the world's strongest military backed by mercenaries. I point your direction of your gaze to Washington, D.C. we're the strongest military and we use mercenaries. When we claim we leave a country, we send our mercenaries in. I'd like to ask you, I heard you say to him, we're not Cambodia, we're not this, we're not that. And in my mind, I heard a condescending, get serious here. I'm serious. I fear the federal government the way the founders feared what it could become when they wrote that. And if you think we're not Cambodia, we're not this, we're not that, I'd like to know what you think of a federal government that the Department of Justice lawyers write a memo that got leaked and published 1 month ago by NBC News, where they said that our president has the power to order the assassination of any American citizen without trial, without charge, in the dark, with no checks and balances, and that you don't even have to be involved in an ongoing plot. That is a quote from the white paper. They use the phrase broader concept of imminence. So I don't have to have a rocket launcher on my shoulder facing the Concord State House for them to kill me instead of trying to arrest me. I don't even have to be sitting in a table somewhere planning to do so. All I have to do, they say, is to be recently, not defined, let me finish.
Your question to me was, what do I think of that?
No, I haven't got to the end of this statement yet. I'll come up with a question.
Come to the question.
Okay, I thought you wanted a conversation. Isn't that what you came here for?
We're not having a
Is
conversation about the Second Amendment right now.
Yes,
You're having a
we
monologue about
No,
your view
I am
of...
telling you, when you stand there and say that those concerns that were given long ago, when it was written, that a federal government could become so powerful as to become tyrannical, are now, you said you didn't think it was antiquated, but you sort of do act like it's antiquated. And I am asking you, are you aware of the white paper, that all I have to do is an unnamed, high-level official decide that I have been recently involved in activities that could someday lead to a violent attack? And if anybody hasn't read the white paper, I ask you to go home and Google it, because it's there. And that's exactly what it said. That's what Rand Paul stood for 13 hours straight and talked about, because they won't even tell us where they claim they get this right. I want to know who you think...
I think that's profoundly troubling. I agree with you. I do.
And how are we going to have some kind of a registry system if it's going to be based on somebody had to go to seek mental health, professional counseling? How are we going to define that? You say we have to keep it out of the hands of people that shouldn't have it, people that might be ill. Well, what is going to be defined as ill? Half of this country is on antidepressants at one time or another in their lives.
We have to be very careful about what...
Yes, we do, because what we will do is we will drive people... Oh, I'm sorry. Well, I'm afraid, this is my fear, I'm afraid that if we say that if you seek mental health counseling, you're now going to be in a database, and it's going to be cross-referenced, that we're going to drive people away from seeking help when they need it. And we may make a much more dangerous society than we would otherwise. What are your thoughts on that?
I think we need to be very careful about making such definitions and balancing the rights of individuals who have gone to seek treatment of that kind of privacy, their privacy rights, with the public's right to safety. I think that all needs to be very carefully and thoughtfully discussed and before any decisions are rashly made.
Okay, so my understanding of the Second Amendment was they wanted to protect us from a tyrannical government. That was one of the reasons for passing the Second Amendment. Our government has recently purchased 1.6 billion with a B bullets. That's enough to kill every American, or shoot every American 4 or 5 times. They just bought 2,700 tanks to be used domestically, and they're putting 30,000 drones in the sky, I think within like 2015. So as far as having a tyrannical government, they're certainly laying the groundwork for that. And, you know, I don't feel that my right to protect myself should be infringed when those kind of things are facing me. I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
Well, as I said earlier, I'm not sure your right to protect yourself against, if you fear being attacked by 1,500 tanks or over 1 billion rounds, how are you going to do that all by yourself? The Second Amendment was politics, and it was an institutional way the founders sought to reassure people who were afraid of a too strong federal government that it would run roughshod over the rights of the states. And because the states and Congress shared responsibility for the militia, this was a way of ensuring that the states would be able to keep up their militias and therefore fend off, deter any turn for the worse towards tyranny by the federal government. That's what it was. Now, obviously, times have changed. Today, we don't even have a militia in the sense that it existed then. The National Guard is the closest successor to the militia, but it too can be nationalized and serves as an important adjunct of the U.S. military in most of the recent conflicts we've been involved in. But the way to prevent tyranny is not with bullets in your private hands so much as it is with making effective use of our political system, I submit. And if we haven't done that well enough, well, we have to keep trying.
Hello. The last few days I've been reading or hearing about a study that's just come out where states or areas that have greater gun legislation or regulation have fewer violent crimes. Are you familiar with that study, and have you had an opportunity to read it or look at it and look at the methodology to see if it's...
There's lots of claims like that that are made in particular by the Brady campaign. I don't know. You take states like Vermont that have no gun laws, no state gun laws. The rate of gun violence there is not, it's insignificant compared to the rate in, say, New York State, where the gun laws are pretty strict now. Gun violence depends on a lot of things besides gun laws. It depends on the prevalence of guns,
Right.
and on the social and ethnographic and cultural makeup of different neighborhoods, and it's different in each place. It's hard to make a generalization that strict gun laws deter gun violence. I said earlier, I don't think that's true at all in New York City.
Thank you.
I think there was a noticeable absence in your presentation. I don't recall you mentioning anything about the violence in the movies, the violence on the television. You can't turn a channel on that hasn't got ABC or NBC with somebody with a gun that's just shot another person or whatever they're doing, crazy things. But as an observer, a close observer of the media for a good number of decades now, I've seen a pattern where relativism has been promoted by the major media, and in particular, the New York Times and the Washington Post and such others, where schools, when the discussion came up with parents may be concerned about relativism being brought into the curriculum, there was no debate promoted by the major media to try to give these parents the rights to discipline their children. Relativism was approved by the New York Times. And so we have a society that has grown up now with a culture that has become very coarse, and respect for life is simply not there. During the time it took for you to make this presentation here and to travel here, how many innocent young lives have been taken?
I don't know. Do you have a question for me on?
Well, it most likely numbered in the thousands. And partial birth abortion, which the New York Times.
Okay,
would
we're
not
getting
talk
pretty
about.
far afield here from.
So thousands
the
of
subject.
babies and children.
Yeah,
Okay,
I'm
yes.
not going to address, you know, Roe versus Wade. That's not my subject. I do agree with you that the prevalence of bloody gun violence in many movies and video games and so on is disgusting, and it certainly isn't uplifting. And I can't imagine it doesn't have some effects on people like the shooter in the Aurora movie theater, who dressed himself up like a character in the movie that was showing, the Batman movie. So I deplore that along with you, but I don't think I've seen a single study by anybody on whether that causes gun violence.
Thank you very much for being here tonight. I am a student here at St. Anselm College, but I'm originally from Pennsylvania, and Pennsylvania has the #2 highest membership in the NRA, I think only just second to Texas. And there's over 1 million hunters in Pennsylvania, I myself included. But I do agree with you that it should be time to at least discuss the gun topic. And my question revolves around, in those discussions, people talk about the assault rifles and use the language, and you brought that up. I was wondering if in your book you talk about the language that people use to kind of push their views on people.
Yeah, the book goes into a lot of arguments, both by the NRA and against it, on assault rifles and many other things. I should say that I'm a member of the NRA myself. I don't own a gun, but I do belong to the NRA, and the NRA does some very constructive things. Instruction classes, for instance, I think are models, and I think myself that gun ownership ought to be connected with a system by which you have to show somebody, your local sheriff or police chief or police department or somebody, that you know how to use a gun, how to store it properly, what the laws are on when you can use it against somebody else. That isn't the case everywhere. And the NRA should be the one to devise the program if one is ever agreed on, I wrote.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for your question.
Hi. I'm actually glad you're here starting this conversation. I did notice, especially since Newtown, there has been a lot more conversation about this. And you were slamming the NRA a lot, but one thing you didn't mention was when they first came out, was talking about the importance of mental health. I mean, if you go back to Columbine and Newtown and the movie theater shooting, all these people were involved. They were either on psychoactive drugs or they were under, or should have been under, psychiatric care. So this is, I think a lot of people get lost in the fact that someone's using a gun and forgetting about the personal responsibility, which you did talk about. I think it's a societal issue. I just listened to an interview with someone who did gang intervention, and he said communities and families counter gangs. So I'm wondering, from your opinion, is this more of a societal personal responsibility issue more than necessarily a gun issue, or is it, as you just sort of pointed out, that if gun owners took more responsibility and we as a society took more responsibility for our actions, some of the less moral relativism the previous question talked about, that this might actually be a better solution and perhaps solve some more problems rather than worrying so much about gun registration or magazine limits and some of the technical details, trying to solve this legislatively where it may be more of a moral or educational issue.
I'm not sure I fully understand what you're getting at, but I'll attempt an answer, and thank you for that question. I do think, as I said, that there must be many, many gun owners and members of the NRA who don't agree with its, resist any kind of gun control, period, attitude. And they know better than most people what guns can do and how to use them safely, and who shouldn't be allowed to have them, who should be prevented from having firearms. And what I think we need to do as a political process is talk to each other about ways we can agree on to accomplish that. And certainly participation by NRA members and anybody else who cares about the right to keep and bear arms, rather than just kind of boycotting discussions, as the Republicans on the Senate Judiciary Committee did yesterday. That's the constructive way forward, the only one I can see. It's not going to result in a panacea. We're not going to eliminate gun violence all at one stroke by any kind of gun control measure. Gun control alone won't do it. You need to address these other issues. The issue of mental health. The NRA was right to bring that up at the beginning, right after Newtown. And the president did too in his proposals.
You seem to believe, sir, that apparently limiting a magazine to 5 to 7 rounds would be an adequate solution. However, there was a study done recently comparing a qualified police officer to a woman, and they fired one 30-round magazine, two 15-round magazines, and 6 5-round magazines. To compare the time it would take to shoot all 30 rounds, there was a minimal amount of difference between either one of those candidates, including a woman who was not a trained. So I can't see how limiting the magazine is going to solve a problem of somebody wanting to go off with mass shooting. What would your answer be to that?
It won't.
All right.
It won't, but it might help.
We'll see.
Okay, final question.
Hi, I'm a Democrat, and I'm a gun owner, and that's always an interesting combination these days. But I grew up in rural New Hampshire. There were always guns in the house. I bought one at age 18. And my question is I have Democratic or liberal Democratic friends that I hear talking about gun issues, and I have conservative gun-owning friends talking about gun issues, and they seem to be talking in completely different languages. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And I'm kind of in the middle, not agreeing with either side and not really seeing the solution until we have some sort of language in which we can talk to each other about these issues. So I'd love to hear your thoughts on that.
Well, that's why I wrote this. to do exactly what you're talking about, to try to find a way to talk to people who care deeply about gun rights, coming from the other side as a liberal. I'm not a gun owner, but I'm a liberal and a member of the NRA. To say, look, we can talk to each other about this if we'll just calm down and be reasonable. You won't agree with everything I say, I won't agree with everything you say, but we can agree on some things. Let's go with that. So I would urge you to buy this book for all your friends, or to tell them to buy it and see if that helps. Thank you. Thank you very much.